President Biden is now the first sitting U.S. president to visit Tulsa, Oklahoma, to honor the victims of the 1921 race massacre. Monday marks 100 years since a white mob torched homes and businesses in the affluent black community known as the Greenwood district. The area known as Black Wall Street was left in ruin. Historians estimate as many as 300 people were killed. To this day, no one has ever been prosecuted in connection to the racial violence. None of the victims have ever been compensated. In a speech Wednesday, President Biden said he was there to acknowledge the truth of the tragedy.
For much too long, the history of what took place here was told in silence, cloaked in darkness. But just because history is silent, it doesn't mean that it did not take place. And while darkness can hide much, it erases nothing.
Vice President Harris also met with survivors of the massacre. They're hoping a landmark lawsuit filed against the city of Tulsa and other entities could lead to some form of reparations after decades of trying. The meetings come as Congress is in recess, but the White House and Senate Republicans are still trying to reach an infrastructure deal. On Wednesday, President Biden is set to meet with the GOP's lead negotiator, West Virginia's Shelley Moore Capito. Last week, Republicans presented a $928 billion counteroffer in response to the White House's $2 trillion bill. President Biden is opening his doors to GOP negotiators as well as his staff at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. White House officials tell CBS News that employees will return to campus full-time between July 6th and 23rd. It's being described as a phase-in and a transition, not a full return. For more, let's bring in Nancy Cordes and Zeke Miller. Nancy is CBS News chief White House correspondent, and Zeke is a CBSN political contributor and White House reporter for the Associated Press. Welcome to you both. Nancy, let me begin with you. What was behind the president's decision to visit Tulsa and honor victims of a massacre that had largely been forgotten until recent years?
Well, as he said in the speech, Elaine, he wanted to draw attention to this very seminal event in history that he argued had really been covered up and ignored over the past 100 years. He pointed out right at the top of his speech that he was the first president in those 100 years to go to Tulsa to talk about what had happened there, the hundreds of African Americans who had been killed, the fact that no one was ever prosecuted for their deaths, and to talk about the wounds that remain in that town, in the African American community writ large, since that terrible day. He said this was not a riot, as it was sometimes referred to. This was a massacre. And then he also went there, Elaine, to talk about some elements of his proposal when it comes to equity, which has really been one of the pillars of the Biden platform. So he talked about the fact that he believes that his administration can do some things on its own to level the playing field. For example, when it comes to housing, he talked about redlining. He talked about the fact that houses in African-American neighborhoods still often will be appraised less than identical houses in white neighborhoods. And he said that his administration would be reinstating some fair housing rules that had been rolled back under the Trump administration. He said that his administration would be steering more federal contracts to minority-owned businesses. And then he called for Congress to pass his infrastructure proposal because it contains more funding that he argues will help African Americans in particular, but minorities more broadly, including a $10 billion fund to that would essentially help places like Greenwood, Oklahoma, a community revitalization grant to help neighborhoods that are struggling. And so, you know, this was really an opportunity for the president to show that he cares about these issues. He hears the anguish that has been expressed by Black Americans over the past couple of years. Racial justice has really been on the forefront for him and for Vice President Kamala Harris. And so this was an opportunity for him to talk about all of that.
And Zeke, Nancy pointed out some of those initiatives that President Biden highlighted while he was in Tulsa. Can you talk more specifically? How is it that President Biden and the White House are trying to sort of connect the dots to instances like what took place in Tulsa, Oklahoma 100 years ago in 1921, to the need to address racial inequity and racial inequality today?
One great example, and it ties into a little bit what Nancy just touched on, is what the White House is talking about, a $15 billion proposal that's in the president's American jobs plan, that $2 trillion plus infrastructure proposal that is certainly now the subject of intense back and forth between the White House and Capitol Hill. And that $15 billion request for funding would be to sort of either to study or actually in some cases dismantle the legacy of efforts over a century to sort of divide communities, often on racial lines, to put in now blighted infrastructure. We've seen lots of cities across the country now trying to sort of reconnect parts of cities and towns and remove the barriers that have physically separated communities, often along racial lines, and try to lead to bring about a more sort of a cohesive and unified future. As a result of that, that has become really increasingly a bipartisan priority. As a lot of mayors and governors have embraced that as a way to sort of really bring communities together. That's why we're going to hear a lot more about that from the White House as they try to get that broader jobs package passed. They're trying to tie the past into the future, as you mentioned.
Well, Nancy, it's interesting, though, the president is facing some sharp criticism for not doing enough on student loan debt forgiveness. The president of the NAACP says that student loan debt is directly related to the racial wealth gap in this country. What happened to that part of the Biden agenda?
Right. I mean, that was something that the president said when he was campaigning he would seek to do right away. That's something that if he wants to do it on a permanent basis, he would have to do it with legislation. And as you know, he's got a very ambitious slate of legislative proposals that are already waiting for congressional approval. So the White House just hasn't quite gotten there yet. As Zeke mentioned, when it comes to reparations, that's another issue that many African Americans wish that this White House would speak out on more forcefully. He sort of danced around the issue a little bit today, but there is a bill in Congress that would create a 13-member commission to study whether reparations would be warranted and who would receive them, and make recommendations to Congress. That bill just passed one hurdle, which is a lot further than it's gotten in decades, but still has a very long way to go, a real uphill climb to ever be passed into law. And there are some Democrats who support the legislation who think that it might have more of a fighting chance if President Biden would speak out in favor of it more aggressively. The White House has said he does favor it, but they haven't said much more than that. And they certainly haven't gone as far as to say that he supports reparations either for descendants of victims of the Tulsa massacre or descendants of slaves more broadly. And so when the president was making his remarks and talking about all of the initiatives that he wants his administration to undertake, those two big aspects, the student loan forgiveness, which student loan debt is a big driver of racial economic inequality in this country, and then reparations. Those were two areas we did not hear much, if anything, from him today.
All right, let's turn to infrastructure. Zeke, President Biden is slated to meet with Republican Senator Shelley Moore Capito to discuss infrastructure on Wednesday. What's on the docket for that meeting, and when might the White House close the door on negotiations?
Well, on the docket is the White House evaluating that Republican counterproposal that was released last week, where we saw Republicans come up in their offer back to the White House. But not all of that. Most of that money was not new money. From a budgetary standpoint, a lot of it was taking money from COVID relief and repurposing it towards infrastructure. That to the White House is essentially a non-starter. The White House has not set a clear deadline. There was that sort of informal Memorial Day deadline that we are now well past. There's beginning to be some movement next week legislatively on the Democratic side to try to move unilaterally on some of these efforts. So that could be sort of a structural deadline by which the White House would sort of have to sort of just determine whether or not they want to move ahead solo or continue these negotiations with Republicans. But it's important to note more broadly in all of this, the White House has always been kind of pessimistic that they would be able to cut a deal with Republicans, that there were going to be 10 Republican senators out there who would come across the aisle for legislation like this. For them, this has always been more about the journey than the destination. They want President Biden to appear to be magnanimous, to appear to reach across the aisle, to try to have these sorts of engagements with Republican senators, so that if and likely now when Democrats have to go down the path of reconciliation to do this, as the president said he would if he can't reach a bipartisan agreement, it will sort of be the path of last resort. They will have exhausted all the other options to reach across the aisle. And the White House believes that that is a powerful political cover for them as they move to pass something this large, this massive legislation in the weeks and months ahead.
Interesting. Well, turning to cybersecurity, Nancy, officials at the world's largest meat processing company, JBS, confirmed that they are the victims of a ransomware attack originating in Russia. This comes just a month after a Russia-based cyber attack took down the Colonial Pipeline. How is the White House responding?
Well, they say that they are in touch with the company, that they were informed about this on Sunday. They say that the Department of Agriculture is working with this meat company, that the FBI is investigating and offering assistance as well. But you're right, it's very troubling, especially coming so close on the heels of this other big ransomware attack of the Colonial Pipeline just a couple of weeks ago. And certainly there's concern that this shows that some of these hackers are getting emboldened, especially if they are actually able to collect ransom from these companies that they attack. So a White House official telling us today the FBI is investigating and that they're coordinating with the FBI to offer technical support, but that the White House is engaging now directly with the Russian government on this matter and delivering the message to Russia that responsible states do not harbor ransomware criminals. Now, a White House press official was asked whether all of this has any bearing on the president's planned summit with Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia, in just about a week and a half, and she didn't say that this would do anything to halt plans for that summit. Those plans are already well underway, but the U.S. Looking to send a message here that they say will be reiterated in person when the president does sit down with Vladimir Putin in Geneva.
Well, Zeke, over the weekend, QAnon held a conference in Texas where Trump allies Michael Flynn and Sidney Powell spoke. Here's the former National Security Advisor responding to a question from an attendee. Let's listen.
I want to know why what happened in Myanmar can't happen here. No reason. I mean, it should happen here. No reason. But that's right.
So both Flynn and Powell asserted that the former president could somehow return to power within months, something the New York Times reports. Mr. Trump has also been telling people. How pervasive and influential is this movement, which is, as we've reported, not rooted in a factual belief system?
It's not pervasive by any stretch, but it's sort of the squeakiest wheel. It is now taking up so much of the oxygen within the Republican Party, whether there are the small there's the small segment of the population that are adherents. There are a larger section that may be sort of curious. They're open to it. They get a rise out of it. For them, it's almost entertainment. And then they're also sort of this, and then they're the ones who sort of have to reckon with it within their party. It is now the center of what people like Michael Flynn say in these sorts of events. And it's astonishing that is a former U.S. military general endorsing that sort of behavior, potentially a coup. He tried to walk that back in a social media posting. it's out there. Some of this is entertainment, some of this is money, some of this is politics. This is, it's increasingly where we live in a polarized society where politics has become tribal. And it's not necessarily that core belief often for these voters. It is a sense of association, of grievance that they're trying to carry forward. It becomes very easy to we will begin to see a lot of Democrats start suggest sort of tarring all Republicans with believing that. It's much more nuanced than that. But that's going to be the real challenge for Republicans in the next year and a half now, before the midterm elections, is can they, reckon with this force, this element within their party, and cast away all of what is essentially craziness, and stick to the facts. And right now, they haven't shown the ability to do that.
Yeah, a huge challenge for a group that has clearly no place for facts in their belief system. All right, Nancy Cordes and Zeke Miller, thank you both very much.
You're welcome.
Thank you.